My name is David Mills, and I'm Vice President at Kellogg. And it's a huge privilege to be introducing our first speaker for Meeting Minds 2023. This is obviously a really important part of our college calendar, and we really value and really love seeing our alumni and friends coming back. And this is your college, this is for you, this place, and it's great to be able to host events like this each year. And who better to start than Liz, who has been such a great support of the college. You were a senior tutor for many years, and I know your work is really appreciated by many of your students. Someone last night was asking after you at the reception last night. So with no further ado, the Durham Ox, Custom and Commerce in the Medieval Northeast. Elizabeth, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you. And thank you all for coming on this lovely sunny morning to sit inside and listen to this. And thank you all of the people, all of the professional staff at Kellogg who supported, arranged the events for Meeting Minds. It's an awful lot of work behind the scenes, and you're like swans paddling hard on sea. Thank you very much. So the provisional title of my next book is The Durham Ox. And the actual Durham Ox it's a painting, and it's copied onto the suspense. Amazing.
Excuse me, it might be better to have a blind down because it's difficult to see the screen.
Thank you. So there at last is the dear Durham Ox. It's copied onto porcelain. This was my dear husband, who's actually here, was going to buy this plate for us. But when it went for auction, it went for nearly as much as was offered for the original Durham Ox actual animal. Because it was so incredibly valuable. So we haven't actually got this in our house. So if anyone has one at home that they want to, get rid of, my email is public knowledge, so don't hold back. But there really was a Durham Ox, and it was a model of selective breeding in the agricultural revolution of the 18th century, which one of the purposes or the achievements of the agricultural revolution, maybe not altogether positive, it was to develop animals for their size and their weight and their greater productivity, and in this case, the shorthorn cattle. So the Durham Ox is the only animal that I know of that's actually got dates like kings or people. So the Durham Ox, 1796 to 1807. It was a celebrity. It was exhibited all around the country with a travelling showman, John Day. There he is. And one of the Oxford connections is that the Durham Ox sadly died in Oxford. So the passing over of the Durham Ox, as in Oxford, took place in this very city. John Day, this is also my wallpaper on my computer, but having researched John Day a bit more, I'm going to change it, because he made so much money out of this animal, inviting people to come and look at it on display because it was so massive. When it died, he actually charged people to come and watch it die over several hours. So pictures of the Durham ox are apparently it's the most produced animal in pictorial representation. I think there are probably more pubs named after the Durham ox than maybe not any other pub, but it's a very popular pub name, particularly as you might expect in the north of England. Anyway, this is a blue earthenware platter reproduction of the painting by the famous artist John Maltby. So lots for you to explore about the Durham ox. Links between Durham and Oxford, as I'm sure you know, go back to the medieval period and the foundation of Durham College, which it was on the site of where Trinity College, one of the older, more uncertain colleges, unlike this present one, which is so new and we know everything about its history. But the real reason for choosing the title for the Durham Ox as the title for my book is that it exemplifies the reason for the approach that I've taken to my research, and I just wanted to explain a bit about that. So the ox is the archetype of the variation that could exist between consumables which have the same Latin name. I know that's a lot taken in one sentence, but I'll explain. So even before the agricultural revolution happened in the 18th century, which led to animal breeding, an ox could be many things. So it could be a breeding animal, it could be a working animal, it could be one that was intended for slaughter, for meat. If so, it might also have been fattened on grain, on local pasture. It could, at the other end of the scale, have died of disease. And yes, they did eat animals that had died of disease. Waste not, want not. So each of these types of ox had a different value. And the same is true for most of the commodities that I'm investigating for my book. And the purpose of the book is to try to understand more about the economic experience of the medieval Northeast. And why would anyone actually want to do that when there are perhaps so many more exciting things that one could spend one's life doing. I have been working on this for a very long time, and so stories I have to tell about the things that have happened during the course of my research are perhaps more interesting than the research itself. However, this is an academic lecture, so let's get to the point. I should mention as well that the work has been going on for a long time, so I've had a lot of moral support, family support, friend support, and financial support. The ESRC, the Society of Antiquaries of London, the Institute of Historical Research, University of Oxford John Bell Fund, the University of Oxford Department for Continuing Education. So absolutely no pressure on me to finish this off and get it published. Oh, and I didn't even mention the University of Durham, most recently, its research fellow scheme. So the purpose, as I said, is to understand the economic experience of the Northeast through the medium of prices of consumables. So what people were buying and selling, how much they were paying for the goods that they needed, always a key economic indicator. And what better time, I did actually organise the cost of living crisis, increase public awareness of the relevance of my research. Of course, in the Middle Ages, we don't have the consumer prices index. But at the most obvious level, goods cost more if they're in high demand relative to supply. And the prices of different categories of commodity tell us different things. So, oh, it did it, that's such a relief. Here are a few commodities knocking around my home. Prices of grain tell us about the success or failure of the harvest, and think of events currently in Eastern Europe and how critical that is. Harvests depend in the Middle Ages very much on weather and climate, then as now. Prices of animal tell us about the availability of pasture, people's meat-eating habits, and the prevalence of animal disease. Again, really important for standards of living in the Middle Ages. Prices of raw materials such as wool and animal skins tell us about international trade links and manufacturing both abroad and domestically. Prices of imports such as wine or salt or some kinds of iron tell us about trade routes and links to international markets and how those might have been affected by war. Prices of cloth tell us about manufacturing in the locality and demand for such manufacturers. Prices of fish, can you believe it, will tell us about the impact on people's practices of religious customs. So if everybody's eating fish in Lent, the price of fish will go up. It's really important. It goes straight down after Easter. Wax prices can tell us about devotional practices. So all these things, the prices of individual commodities can tell us a lot of specific things, but taken together, we can learn about population trends and levels, we can learn about money supply, and we can learn about standards of living. And all these things are really interesting and important. So why would it be that when I'm at parties or at work or wherever, and I say, I'm doing a project on price history in the Northeast, you go, oh, that's not done very often, is it? Or, how good of you? So I think, and I get it, what they've got in mind is just a sort of version of some dreadful typescript list of impenetrable figures. And also, I suppose, because they might guess that the evidence base is medieval shopping receipts, hence my first slide, not that those were medieval. So I have to think that examining other people's shopping habits is a very interesting and informative social pastime. So there's a shopping basket, as you can see. So we all do it, don't we? Have you not ever stood in whichever supermarket you shop in and looked at what the person in front of you is buying? And have you ever formed opinions about that person on the basis of what's in their shopping trolley? It's even more fun if you don't look at them first. And look at the trolley and that's it. So what kind of moral decay has induced the person in front of you to buy all those ready meals, all those fizzy drinks, packaged out of season, imported, worse, cut up fruit, and frozen chips? How superior are we with our organic cotton produce bags containing modest supplies of locally sourced seasonal fruit and vegetables, our organic wholemeal bread, and our minimal packaging? So I'm a really honest academic, so I bought those things. I didn't have the nerve to fill up another shopping trolley with all the naughty things and then just put them all back, or worse, leave them on the floor. I really bought those things. I hid a couple of things underneath. Because you can't advertise, other people's packaging. So those of us in the supermarket queue are able to match the contents of the shopping basket to the individual person, and then we can confirm our view. Well, what do you expect? Wearing those kind of clothes, I'm not surprised that person is buying those things. But even then, our judgments are very unreliable. What's in their basket might be completely untypical of what they buy. When I buy several bottles of wine, I always say to the next person, having a party. The person might be buying for a relative. That's another one can say. Or they might be supplementing the shopping that they do in another supermarket, in the supermarket that you're in with them. So imagine how much more potentially risky it is to be looking at medieval shopping receipts. So in my case, it's about looking at the account rolls of the Benedictine Priory of Durham. And the Priory has left us an absolutely magnificent archive, another piece of pressure for me. Every single item in it to be treasured and used. Not least because so much of Britain's monastic heritage in the form of buildings and literature and visual art was destroyed in the Reformations of the 16th century. Bodley's librarian, Richard Ovenden, has estimated in his recent lovely book, it's called Burning the Books, A History of Knowledge Under Attack. Do read it if you haven't. He estimates that more than 90% of the literary works, and not just literature, but admin records, were destroyed at the Reformation. 90% of what was in monastic libraries. So at Durham, some of the material was even lost during the Middle Ages due to recycling or loss or damp or whatever. But a lot of its treasures have survived, mainly because the priory wasn't destroyed, but it was reformed and became the dean and chapter of the cathedral that we now have. So we have the accounts of a whole plethora of officer monks, as well as deeds and court rolls, rentals and manorial accounts. To say nothing of all the histories and the chronicles and the saints' lives and the learned works and the maps. Some of the beautiful things that has come down to us from Durham. And I didn't even mention the loss of stuff because of the Vikings before they went to Durham, the monks went to Durham. So sadly, it's none of this that I'm interested in, it's the account rolls, and some of them are so bad that they wouldn't even photograph to show you on a screen. So the account rolls, those are lots of different officer monks, and they had many different responsibilities. And a lot of those who became monks would have ended up doing admin. So you think you're going to go for this great career, you end up doing admin. And Durham Cathedral Priory, as the great historian Barry Dobson reminded us of many years ago, it was the largest ecclesiastical household north of York. And it had to be supplied with food and drink and clothes, fuel for heating and for cooking. As a religious community, divine service was absolutely the priority and had to be maintained, which meant constant supplies of fabric for ecclesiastical vestments and the monks' habits, wax for candles, parchment for liturgical books, and many, many other items. Buildings and their fixtures, the abbey church and the cloister and service buildings, all of those had to be maintained. Just some pictures of the magnificent cloister, Bishop Hatfield's tomb, and the nave of the great Romanesque cathedral. So how many people are we talking about? What sort of people? So at the heart of the monastic community were the monks, including the fully professed ones and the novices. But then there are the hangers-on, the prior's retinue, people who, not necessarily ecclesiastics, not necessarily clergy, but lay supporters. Then there are visitors to the abbey, lots of them, servants who did the cooking and the cleaning and the washing and the brewing and the care of the horses. And of course, beyond the household itself, the monastic community had to care for the local poor in various ways. So all of that makes it quite difficult to know the overall numbers. So when you're looking at quantities of food that appear to be consumed, you're not necessarily sure who is eating it. It may be many people. So the accounts cover the purchases for the household, but also the administration of the extensive properties that belong to it. So I've got two contrasting pictures here. One, the monks doing what we think they're doing, that is singing in the choir, and then the monk going out into the countryside administering the estates. This is Chaucer's monk, rather fond of hunting and a very, very nice horse. So the cathedral priory did have a lot of estates to administer, both in the city and the county of Durham, in Northumberland, in Yorkshire, and as far as Scotland. And their estates were in the form of manors that had to be farmed directly or leased. But of huge significance as well were the many churches that belonged to the abbey and which yielded income in the form of tithes. I just took a couple of pictures of two completely different churches. One is St. Margaret of Antioch in Durham. You can see the cathedral and the castle in the background. And then there's Kirk Merrington just outside. There are many, many more. The estates had to be stocked with livestock, produce had to be sold, rents had to be collected. And the buildings on the estates, as well as the abbey buildings, had to be equipped and repaired. So it's not surprising that Chaucer's monk was somebody that might have been seen in the countryside, because literally they had to go out and negotiate the sale of tithes. They had to sell their wool, and they had to buy things and get the best prices for them. So the discharge of all those responsibilities enables us to, or me, to extract prices for a whole range of consumables, as well as a lot of fascinating detail about the lives of the monks in the later medieval period. And that in turn tells us about the economy of the northeast. So for me, Durham isn't just another big monastery with a good set of records. What's different is its location. And what's tended to happen in the past, and this may resonate with all of us, is that the history of our country, but I think particularly in the medieval period, has tended to be dominated by the records from the farther south. Of course, we're all farther south now, but at least David knows about Lindisfarne or Holy Island, and many, many others will as well. But what has been said, or what has been claimed about the history of the whole country, has been based on the copious, admittedly, records from the south, and it's claimed that the story of the country as a whole will be similar to that. Now, it is true that it's in the south where the monarch and the seat of government are placed, so a lot of events happen down in the south, in the southeast. The south is also more densely populated and there are more towns. But from everything, literally this week, everything that goes on in the country is not just about London or Westminster. It's about the whole of Britain. So I wanted to find out the extent to which, this idea of the north-south divide, or what's happening in the regions. The northeast needs to tell its own story and to make its own story. I told somebody recently, it was like, not only is she studying prices, but she's studying the northeast. Somebody said, well, that'll be a short book. It didn't have an economy, did it? After the harrying of the north by William the Conqueror. Very dangerous remark to make a party. Yet, the region had all sorts of natural advantages, proximity to the North Sea, which is the key trade route in Europe in the Middle Ages, markets for livestock, the availability, as was found out rather later, of rich mineral reserves. Well, there was coal mining in the Middle Ages, but nothing like what took off in the 16th century. So the idea that the Northeast is somehow disadvantaged, whether relatively or absolutely, as a result of war or climate, or because of its perceived remoteness from where the real action was, that whole thing needs to be challenged, in my view. And if you look, keep trying to press the slides and make sure it does still work. I don't think this shows up very well, but what it does show is this slide of medieval pilgrimage routes. You can see there are a lot more saints who are visited in the south, but it certainly shows that Durham isn't really in the north at all, is it? Look how far Britain goes up after that. It's practically the Midlands. Anyway, a thought. So, to get on to the actual story. So, I should explain that the starting point is the later 13th century, when the first accounts survive at Durham. That's no coincidence. The 13th century was a time of population growth, trade growth, time when landlords were starting to administer their estates with a lot more care and attention, and making sure that all the dues that were due to them were actually coming in. It was a time, foundation of schools for like the first business schools. So a lot of these accounts actually look very similar to one another because everybody's following a similar sort of format. And it's the time of the growth of the money economy. So not just exchange of goods and services for other goods and services, but the use of currency. So critically important time. Durham Cathedral Priory by that point was already an ancient and venerable institution. Its history goes back to the year 995, when the community of St Cuthbert, who had first been founded on Lindisfarne, or Holy Island, they'd fled from that island to escape, not just for themselves, but to bring St Cuthbert's body safely back to the mainland from the Viking raids. And the peninsula on the River Wear seemed to be a place that was perfect because it's high on a rock and it's surrounded on three sides by water. Sorry, this was just to show you the growth of towns. It's much later that. If you've been to Durham, you realise that it's a very high climb to get up to the cathedral. But it was a safe resting place for St Cuthbert's body. And after the Norman conquest, the canons who'd served the first church there were replaced by monks, Benedictine monks. So part of William the Conqueror's kind of cultural conquest was to reform English ecclesiastical institutions so that they became more like continental ones. So it was refounded as a Benedictine community. And the leading light in this is William de St Calais, who was the Bishop of Durham. And it was he who first started to build the cathedral as we know it today in the year 1093. And the monks themselves built their cloister. So the whole point of a Benedictine community, and the Rule of St Benedict is a very beautiful read. So that's 2 books, as well as researching the Durham Ox and Richard Ovington's book. Now you've got to read the Rule of St Benedict. The whole point was the communal life spent in prayer and worship, learning and study and work. And the individual monks on admission were bound to constancy, conversion of life, and obedience. And the community was also supposed to welcome visitors. I hope it's becoming clear that the cathedral priory was actually many things and can yield many treasures for the historian. It was a business, It was a symbol of ecclesiastical power. It was a centre for offering divine service. It was a place of hospitality, and it was the safe resting place for the body of St. Cuthbert. There's the River Wear, there's Durham Cathedral, and there is what remains of the shrine of St. Cuthbert, and also the head of King Oswald of Northumbria, who died in 642. So that's the shrine of St. Cuthbert as one can see it now. So, okay, back to money and prices. In the later 13th century, there are lots of signs in the accounts that the regional economy was actually doing rather well. I'm just going to talk about a few commodities, and I'm not going to show you any nasty lists of prices. So first of all, the region was benefiting from a huge growth in demand for English wool, for manufacturing fine cloths in the Low Countries, what's modern day Belgium and Holland. And sheep's wool was England's North Sea oil. It was so valuable. It was a wonderful thing. And now, did you know, any farmers here? The cost of shearing a sheep is greater than you will get for the wool that comes off it. So large monasteries and other big landowners had huge flocks of sheep, and they collected and sorted and sold vast amounts of wool. And the income from that enabled major building projects, and some believe that the buildings of the Middle Ages are their greatest legacy to us. Of course, there are many other wonderful medieval legacies, but this is something that we can really see. For the Durham monks, I can't say that wool was their major item of income as it was for some, even at the height of the wool trade in the later 13th and early 14th centuries, but it was certainly very important to them. And sails, interestingly, were being made as far south as Boston in Lincolnshire, and so the monks would travel down with their wool, and they would take the opportunity to go to Boston Fair and buy all sorts of imports, so wine and spices and furs and fine cloths. At the same time, they were also selling a lot of animal hides to export merchants for making into leather and all the many things that leather was used for in the Middle Ages. So harnesses, saddles, wine containers, some kinds of wine container anyway, even armour. So hides were a byproduct of meat consumption. And remember, there's no plastic or rubber or strengthened heat-resistant glass. And glass is very fragile. So at Durham, the monks used leather for all their footwear, for their horse equipment, for bookbinding. But there's one particularly exotic use I did find, I'm going to share with you. On one occasion, they used the hide of an animal to shroud the body of the deceased prior. I don't think that can have gone well because it only happened once. So this rather optimistic picture at the end of the 13th century with buoyant sales, lots of rents, lots of income from churches, gives us a baseline for judging what happened next. One point to make is that the monks were using some of their wool sales as a source of credit. So merchants were buying the wool clip in advance and then getting paid. They were getting the wool later on. But from at least the second decade of the 14th century, things start to take a downward turn. The local chronicler at Durham, Robert Greystones, tells us these were very bad years for the priory's finances. Had to pay out large sums of money to the Pope in connection with the appointment of various successive priors who'd quarrelled with each other about the election. We heard that somewhere before. Think how much money and waste could be involved in that sort of thing. Taxation was another major outgoing, again for the purpose of war, plus local problems, failure of crops, animal disease, and the depredations of the Scots. Oh, I mean the Scottish Wars of Independence. Depending on your point of view. So Durham is not a border county, as you will all know, but during the second decade of the 14th century, particularly after the Battle of Bannockburn, which the Scots won, the Scots came raiding down as far as Yorkshire, and the Durham monks suffered in consequence. And the English army coming back to fight the Scots would also requisition stuff from the Durham monks. By the later 1330s, things were taking yet another downward turn. Wool exports were being overtaxed by the king for his wars against the French. And there was a slump in demand for raw wool from England because of internal problems in the Low Countries. So it became more and more difficult for the Durham monks to sell their wool, and in some years you just don't have any wool sales at all, and then after about 3 years there's a catch-up and they sell the whole lot for a knockdown price. Big problem. And the export trade in hides is going in a similar direction. If things seemed to be bad in the 1340s, they got even worse with the Black Death of 1348-9. Bubonic plague arrived in England in the south, but travelled north as far as Scotland, even though the Scots at first thought that it was a plague just to punish the English for fighting them. That was not the case. But as many as half the population died. Can you imagine that? Think of COVID and the impact that that had. Think of how much bigger half the population going would be. It's very difficult to study the psychological state of people in the past because you can't ask them questions. But the economic impact of the plague was huge and can definitely be observed. Durham Priory couldn't find tenants for its estates, so rents went down. There are lots of reports by bursars saying, I just can't collect the rents. A lot really going wrong. Didn't stop the war against the Scots, however, and Scottish raids continue to be a problem. A question is whether the monks actually escaped the worst of the Scottish raids, and I think they did. They've got a monastery, they're high on a rock, they would escape, but their tenants didn't. And there's an interesting account where the Countess of Angus, so a Scottish noble lady, paid the Durham bursar £10 for damages done to the priory by her husband. So imagine the conversation at dinner that night. The arrival of armies from the south, that is the English, as I've said before, could sometimes make things even worse because they'd be looking up that they'd have to be put up, accommodated, at least the leaders would be, by the monks. They'd requisition grain and livestock. And the Durham monks' tenants sometimes had to go and support the war themselves. The monks were buying bows and arrows in preparation for their tenants going to fight at the Battle of Otterburn, which was another victory for the Scots in 1388. And those who didn't come back from the Battle of Otterburn had to be let off their rents, so even more problems. 15th century, sorry, it's getting worse, but the monks are going to fight back. Wool sales in the 15th century slump, rents slump, everything seems to be a big problem. But what we can observe by closely looking at these records is that actually the monks and the cathedral priory are very resilient. Woolen hides continue to be sold. They're sold in wool is sold in much smaller quantities, but it's sold to local people rather than international merchants. Hides, animal hides, skins, continue to be sold in the same quantities as before, showing that the monks are still eating as much meat as they ever had. So they're trying to keep up their sales and their standards of living. And hides were being sold to local craftsmen, some of whom were organised into syndicates so that they could actually afford to buy large quantities. So the presence of a large ecclesiastical household with access to pasture for animals, a water supply, and oak bark for tanning actually supports the creation of a flourishing local tanning industry. And it's not just for the monks, it's for other people in the region. So having a lot of meat-eating monks really boosts the local economy. So if they're continuing to eat meat, that's a sign of a high standard of living. Another commodity is wine. And what I have noticed is that monks' wine consumption in the later Middle Ages did not decrease at all. Wine was always imported, and so it helps us to understand how international trade was affected by war or other international developments. The size of the consumption seems to be very huge. Barrels containing up to 252 gallons of wine were bought regularly by the monks every year. By this point, they're buying at Newcastle, so again, supporting regional trade. Smaller purchases made in Durham were a bit like buying at the corner shop when unexpected visitors arrived, and that's bought by the gallon and is more expensive because it's had to be carried. Carriage of wine was a huge additional expense, something like an extra 20% of the total cost. So as you would expect, the cost of importing wine from France, the king has just visited an organic vineyard in Bordeaux, hasn't he? So, just reminding us that the king too is thinking about the Middle Ages, really. And of course, all medieval vineyards, I think, were pretty much organic. Wine was probably imported from Bordeaux to London and then was transferred with smaller ships along the coast. Prices in Durham were much higher than those further south, so that was bad news. And particularly after the loss of Bordeaux to the French in 1453. But despite all those problems, those monks persisted in drinking. How much of it was for themselves, we don't know. Some of it's for guests, particularly for the big feasts in the priory. Some is for the prior when he's away on holiday. Yes, some monks did have holidays. Some wine was for presents for people, important people, strategic gift giving. So in 1379, a pipe of Malmsey, a pipe, it's 126 gallons, were given to the Archbishop of Canterbury, who also happened to be the King's Chancellor, to acquire his friendship towards us in the confirmation of our charters. And that's perfectly fine in the Middle Ages. You just record it, that's why you did it. That was the justification of spending the money. And there's lots of other examples of that. So at a time of economic downturn, I'm sure the business and investment people among us will confirm this, it's really important to keep up appearances. You don't cut down on your advertising when things are going badly, you do quite the opposite. And we should also note, on our sort of holier note, that the monks are continuing to keep up all the divine service because they're spending the same money on wax as they ever were. But display in the Middle Ages was incredibly important. You haven't got the ways of projecting yourself that we have now through media. So what you look like, what your home looks like, the way you entertain people matters hugely. The proportion of money from produce that's spent on conspicuous display might seem shocking to us now, but it was the way in which you you displayed but also acquired power. It was also a way in which you attracted patronage. I should have shown you this before. The dear medieval craftsman, working hard, supported by the monks. If the monks' standards of living were being maintained, though, it may have been a way for them to continue to recruit new monks at a time of population stagnation. The population simply did not recover after all those outbreaks of plague. But Durham Priory continued to be successful. 80 monks was the peak before the plague, but even on the cusp of the Reformation, in the generation before the Reformation, they were still doing quite well. So 67 monks by 1529 is slightly down from 80, but given that half the population has gone, it's not bad going. So it was recognised by the Benedictine community at large that standards of living, material standards of living, and the ability to attract recruits, the two were very much linked. So here we have the priest king Henry V. This is from the Royal Collection. And Henry V, a sort of ascetic, holy, priestly king. Everything he did was for some sort of holy, self-justifying kind of purpose. But he sought in 1421 to reform the Benedictine order, making calls for greater austerity in standards of food and clothes and accommodation. And also, you guys need to pray more, like me. But the Benedictine community got his list of proposals and that's never going to work. We won't get anyone to join us if we have to do all that stuff. So complete disincentive. Not just about attracting recruits. If you continue to display well, you will continue to show people that you matter, that you're still relevant, you're still a going concern. It's really interesting to see the late medieval building projects. So Bishop Hatfield's tomb, circling back to Oxford, Bishop Hatfield, founder of what it was then Durham College, what's now Trinity College. This is his magnificent tomb in Durham Cathedral. Here we have the Neville screen behind the high altar, the feretory, the shrine is behind that again, and built with the support of John Lord Neville, completed in 1380, post-plague, time of real economic downturn. So I've nearly finished, I've got 1 minute, so then we'll have questions if you would like. So one of the most important things about being an historian, and I mean any academic, I think, is that you have to work with what you have. So we don't have the census, we don't have records of individual monks. We can't design scientific experiments. We're not looking at somebody's real shopping trolley. So the accounts weren't made for me to understand strategic management of the monks in the late Middle Ages. They don't tell me, why did any of you become monks? What is your plan? Do you not realise that in 10 years, Henry VIII is going to come and dissolve you if you don't step up? What attracted you to a life of prayer? Maybe nothing. Maybe you just wanted to be an administrator and you thought you'd do better in a monastery than just on the local farm. How much does eating really matter to you? All these interesting questions. Oh, and finally, have you treated your tenants fairly? What the accounts, though, can tell us is that the monks really knew their prices. They were also really good accountants. I can't tell you. I hope you will be really nice to me. The number of sums I have had to do and check them. And the monks hardly ever got it wrong. But the monks were very much aware of what was happening in the local economy. They were aware that you need to negotiate your prices, you need to be flexible about your prices when there are problems. You need to rebuild your buildings because people won't live there. You need to look after your own people. But I suppose a really important message for me, because it's the North East, because it's not London, it's not the wealthy South, the presence of a large ecclesiastical household in the North East created custom for importing merchants, work opportunities for local people, and a market for the produce of the land and local products. And so all large religious houses did that until the 16th century. Thousands of monks and nuns. And in the north, it was even more important because there were so fewer of them. There were many fewer of them. So each one was of proportionately far greater significance to the local economy and a far greater loss when it was dissolved. That's it.
That was absolutely wonderful. You don't need to convince me about the importance of starting from the northeast, but that glimpse you gave us into a regional economy and then to the relationship of the monastery to the society was just brilliant. I've got lots of questions, and I'm going to not dominate. I'm going to quickly ask some questions on the floor. Let's take a couple at a time, please.
Thank you very much. I think somewhere near the beginning of your talk, you indicated that the monastic records were fairly standardised in different monasteries, presumably in different parts of the country, and you hinted that there was a sort of business school type approach. Could you tell me more about that? Because I've not heard that before.
Yes. So you could attend school which taught you how to draw up a manorial account, and so all accounts were not as we would imagine now being double entry bookkeeping. They're all charge and discharge. So you can look at a manorial account from Cuxham in Oxfordshire or one from Durham, and they will look very, very similar. The thing that's different in different ecclesiastical institutions is that the names of the officers might be different. So Durham doesn't have a pittenser, for example. So that sort of thing. So there were also treatises on how to draw up accounts, and people would base their work on that. I'm not sure of the particular individual business schools, but that there were these arrangements is beyond doubt because there's so much standardization. And the idea was to check that people had acted under proper authority for spending money, and that the dues owed to the owner of the land were forthcoming, and if they weren't forthcoming, where were they? So they're not documents that say, oh, this year we've done rather badly because of such and such. You just say what you did. If you haven't received something, then it's discharged. So I'm sure that's only partly answered your question, but yes. 13th century also a time for the development of writing in general and the growth of the law and litigation in general. Yeah. Yes.
How much does Scottish noblewoman pay £10 for her compensation for her husband's damage? What kind of money is that today?
Yes. So go to the National Archives website and look up currency converter. It's great. It's great. So just put in National Archives UK currency converter.
Ah, there we go.
and do tell us the answer.
You spoke a lot in the presentation about sort of the part of the way people were sort of thinking and feeling. I understand that a lot of the sources you were looking at were just sort of lists of prices. How do you sort of marry up the two things in terms of actually how people were thinking and feeling and public sentiment at the time when you don't really have that information?
It's a really good question.
Thank you.
I don't believe you can work out people's psychological states in the past, because the language that we use now to describe them would not have been language that people at the time would have understood. So that's one thing. There are things that we'll never know. But you can understand behaviour. You can understand, for example, that efforts are being made to negotiate, and therefore that the pricing that the transaction produces is something that's been thought about. So, for example, when the bursar travels about the countryside and negotiates with people, when we're told that the prior, they entered into an agreement that was supposed to last for 10 years, but by the prior's grace, they let them off that year because it wasn't possible. So you can infer things. I suppose that if there are other historians here, other social scientists here, any academic will have to form a judgment about the reasonableness of the step they're taking from what the evidence is explicit about to the conclusions they feel confident to draw. I think that's a really long sentence.
No, it's a really good answer.
One of the things that often puzzles me when I go around old buildings, especially churches and cathedrals, etc., is how the building work was organised and financed. The stonemasons, all the years that it's taken to build these buildings, it must have been an enormous organisation. Do you know anything about that?
I agree, it was. Some of these things took generations to build, and you would have had huge armies of masons and carpenters. I think we should be in awe of that. There's the historian, quite a sort of classic, but Saltzman, who's written all about building works. And what I think is different is that the anonymity of a lot of the people involved. You don't have you occasionally do, but mostly you don't know very much about architects. You just know payments to stonemasons day after day. If you do visit buildings, you may encounter masons' marks showing you, I did that bit, that's how far I got in this day, and that's how much I want to be paid. We also know that some of the buildings were experimental, and church towers not infrequently fell down, and things had to be rebuilt or things added on later.
Well, maintenance, did the monks organise the maintenance, or is that a different department?
They did organise the maintenance, they absolutely did. The things that seem to have had to be maintained the most were locks and keys and ironwork in general, and windows.
Stained glass, yeah.
Yes, so stained glass is incredibly fragile, and I think that the iron would have been less durable than the iron we're used to now. So yes, definitely.
And did a lot of masons come from abroad as well? Not necessarily from the northeast.
The only people that I've seen payments to have been at a relatively low, not that low, but Christopher the plumber, or
We know how you used to get summons these days. It must have been quite important to get a very good stonemason.
yes, yeah. I think that's sort of all I can say. As I said, by the time that the accounts stopped, a lot of building work is done, but there is a big remodelling of the cathedral prior in the 15th century. So yes, so patronage to fund it at a time of economic downturn is really important.
So I would imagine that a monk is a person who's looking at books. A builder is a person who just gets on with the job.
Yes, absolutely. We're almost running out of time, so I'm going to seize this last chance. Can we just take 2 or 3 questions, and then you can do your best you can, Liz, to sort of answer the one there, and there's one over here already. Then we must stop at that point, but then Liz, you can respond.
So I apologise, my history on the dates is pretty shaky, but one of the differences of an ecclesiastical organisation in the North East were the bishop princes.
Yes.
And I was wondering to what extent that affected Durham, but also as Bishop Auckland and so on, because that's a whole different area of expense and income and all the rest of it.
Yes.
Can I hold you to that one? I get 2 more questions, is that all right?
Yes.
Before you forget.
I was simply wanting to ask, you made no mention of lay brothers. Are they a distinct class who would do certain jobs and not others? And did they do things in the same way as the monks, or was there very clear demarcation between the two?
Okay, and then one last question.
I wondered, as an accountant, you could explain a little bit more about the difference between charge and discharge and debits and credits.
I absolutely will.
Thank you very much.
Bishop, absolutely, Prince Bishop, separate household. So this is the cathedral priory. The bishop's got all his own estate. Big thing is that you don't get a lot of the royal records for Durham that you would for other parts of the country, because the Prince Bishop is a king in his own domain. But it's a very good point. But you're absolutely right. It's a disadvantage for me because it means that we don't get these amazing government records that we would for the other parts of the country. Thank you. And then the question, lay brothers, yes. They do exist in Benedictine monasteries. They're much bigger in Cistercian houses. I haven't come across too much about the lay brethren in Durham Cathedral, and certainly not in terms of provision of food or accommodation for them. There's much more about servants. So whether they simply don't make that much use of that category of person by this point, I'm not sure why.
Right.
Sorry, right? Charge and discharge. So top section of the account. This is all the income. Arrears are also included there. Then you have your total, and then you discharge all of that. So this is how, these are the rents I didn't receive. This is how I spent all the money that came in. This is what I'm taking forward to next year. So you do have accruals, and you do have schedules of debt that mean that the accountant doesn't actually have to hand over that money because he's listed it all in his list of debts. So it's completely different from double entry bookkeeping. So that's one of the things that can be difficult for historians, because they think, oh my goodness, all this income, and half of it wasn't even received at all. So you have to be careful. But yeah, great question, thank you.
I think next time, Liz, you have to come back and actually give us a lesson in medieval accounting. we can all try and work out how to write down the tithes and the
A workshop.
A workshop, absolutely, yes. I think you'll all agree it's been really fascinating, and I'm now going to look at the Abbey ruins on Holy Island with a whole new eye to thinking about the economy that sustained these beautiful buildings. And you've given us a real sense of the accountability of the monks to themselves, as well as entertaining us. So I think one final round of applause. Thank you very much.